The debate, hydrogen, game changer or overhyped. I'm Luke Brett from Reuters Events. I head up our hydrogen projects, and this is one of several pieces of work we're doing in this space. There are over 2,400 of you signed up today, incredible numbers, so thank you all for the great response. Just a brief bit of housekeeping before we begin. This is being recorded and we will send this to you afterwards, so be no doubt you'll be able to retune into this one. The session format for this is each of our speakers will make an introductory statement, just 2 minutes, and then we'll go straight into our moderated and your questions as the audience. So use that question box to get the questions in. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Simon Ellis, the head of global gas analytics at ICS, and he will be giving an introduction to our panelists, and then we'll go into those opening statements. So thank you again for everyone for joining, and Simon, do you begin the session?
Yeah, thank you, Luke, and thanks everyone for joining today. So the question we are debating is whether hydrogen is a game changer for energy markets or overhyped. So tomorrow will mark the start of the so-called Hydrogen Olympics in Tokyo, and that's an indication of the extent of global policy support that hydrogen is enjoying at the moment. Yet 15 years ago, hydrogen was perceived as going through a hype cycle, in particular around fuel cells for transport. So has the technology and wider political landscape matured enough to assure a different outcome this time? And studies have posited low carbon hydrogen as an affordable pathway to meeting 10% of decarbonisation necessary to limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees. But current fossil fuel-based hydrogen is itself a very large source of global emissions. So to disentangle this issue, we have a distinguished panel combining not only vast technical knowledge on hydrogen, but a commercial track record of delivering energy transition projects. So I'm delighted to welcome Alicia Eastman, co-founder and president of Intercontinental Energy, Paul Martin, who is speaking in his capacity as a process development expert, Fabio Rangino, head of sustainability strategy at Ambienta, and Frank Voters, senior vice president energy transition at Reliance Industries. My own company, ICIS, is an independent provider of analytics and price assessments for commodities, including blue and green hydrogen, and I hope to channel that impartiality as moderator today. So we're expecting a high volume of questions, and I will attempt to aggregate your questions on behalf of the panel. But first, each speaker will give a brief opening statement, setting out their position on the matter at hand. So to start with Alicia, is hydrogen a game changer or overhyped?
I think the question is too binary. I frankly don't think that hydrogen is the panacea for everything, but I think it plays an important role in decarbonizing difficult to decarbonize industries. So where you need a molecule, I think hydrogen, ammonia, and other hydrogen-based products can fill that void. Where you need electricity, I think that's also important. But you need to have many tools in the tool bag, many golf clubs in the bag, if you will. So that's my position on it, and I will let the others state theirs.
I'll pass over to Paul then. Paul, game changer or overhyped?
Well, I think it's definitely overhyped. I think, let's be clear, I'm not against green or even blue hydrogen. The problem I have with hydrogen is that it's a massive yet unsolved decarbonization problem. So we have to actually decarbonize hydrogen first before we can have any leftover to use for other uses. So my big concern is the pitching of hydrogen for use as a fuel. I've been making and using hydrogen and syngas for 30 years in an engineering capacity, and it's a tough fuel. It's a difficult fuel. It's inefficient and ineffective, which makes it challenging for use as a fuel. And you know, when we talk about hydrogen for difficult to decarbonize sectors, that sounds great, and it's really hard to argue against that, except we really need to focus on decarbonizing the easy to decarbonize sectors, and there is actually a lot of cross-sector competition being proposed that, to my mind, doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And lastly, the big thing that I think we're missing is we need the policy support for decarbonization to happen, period. And if we do decarbonization policy support in the wrong way, we will get bad outcomes, meaning we'll spend too many dollars per ton of CO2 emissions that we avert, and that won't be serving our need to mitigate global warming. And that's my position.
Thank you, Paul. And to Fabio next. Do you think hydrogen is a game changer, or do you think it's overhyped?
I tend to agree with Paul. It's overhyped, especially on the media today for the general public. The current pitch oversimplifies the complexity behind the building a value chain across sectors, industries, and on a global scope with such a fuel, and the technological challenges that the industry still face. It has the potential to really change some areas, and then we can debate where it's a good use of hydrogen and a good use of public funding to implement certain application for an investment case that is not there. But it has the potential, but it's definitely overhyped. The pace that everybody is expecting this to develop, and I think the stock markets last year were reflected this hype.
Perfect. Thanks, Fabio. And finally, Frank, what's your view on this subject?
Yes, thanks, Simon. Well, I think we're still underestimating hydrogen, like we did many other things in the past, when it's difficult for the human brain to basically gather exponential growth, and that is something that I see coming, much like solar PV. But let me first start perhaps by stating the obvious, and that is that we need to decarbonize quickly and fast. 200 meters from here, there's a roadblock to stop disaster tourists from going to look at the neighboring municipality, which was completely flooded last week, and had $500 million worth of damage. So decarbonization is certainly something that we need to act upon a lot more seriously than we do right now. Now, of course, the energy sector is a major contributor to carbon emissions, and that has already been a focal point of climate action. But we also know that in recent years, we've seen the tremendous development of technologies that produce electricity from sunshine, wind, and water. And while the resource is free, the technologies, of course, come at a cost. But by scaling up and increasing efficiencies, renewable power is now in most places the cheapest power available, and according to some, we now have the cheapest power in the history of electricity. So the future of electricity is green, and few people argue otherwise. But we must also realize that electricity accounts for only 20% of all final energy, and the remaining 80% are molecules, and those are mostly hydrocarbons. It's oil, gas, and coal. And to tackle climate change, we must decarbonize everything as quickly as possible. All electricity must be green soon, and I'm confident that's possible, as some countries have already shown. But the question is, what are the options for the molecules, which are currently 80% of all final energy? And there's a few options, so that's good. Firstly, we can do a lot more with electricity, and that's what we're doing. We need massive electrification, because as we've seen, that's doable and affordable. We can drive on batteries, we can heat houses with heat pumps, we can convert many industrial processes to run on electricity. And for argument's sake, let's do 2.5 times more with electricity than we do now and cover 50% with electricity. Now, many countries and regions, to be fair, are already struggling today with the expansion of grids. And we don't have a solution everywhere for seasonal electricity storage at the scale we need. So that's not going to be easy, but it can be done. Now, in addition to electricity, there's basically 3 options. We can do biomass, we can capture carbon and store that, and we can do hydrogen. Now let's start with biomass. There certainly is growth potential, and it will be an important component, but there is also limitations dictated by land and water use, monocultures, competition with food, so not without issues. Now, carbon capture and storage, if we want to continue burning hydrocarbons, we must capture and store the carbon, which we will do. We also know that capturing 100% is not possible or affordable. Distributed sources are difficult, and in many applications, there will be cleaner alternatives soon, making such investments risky, and hydrogen is actually a case in point. And lastly, hydrogen. It feels to me a lot like solar PV. It can be produced on a small and on a large scale, basically everywhere, because there is renewable energy everywhere. Now, transporting hydrogen in a pipeline is a lot cheaper than electricity, and in many cases, that infrastructure is already there. And hydrogen can be stored over a season, which is a crucial element of most energy systems. And back to solar PV, it's only recently that we stopped having doubts about it, like some are doubting hydrogen today.
Perfect. Okay, thank you, Frank, and thank you all panelists for their opening statements. And I hope those watching have got some ideas there that we can later pursue. While those questions come in, I'll ask the first question we have a lot of financial and commercial expertise on the panel. And I think I'd like both Fabio and Alicia to answer this question. So governments have ambitious plans for hydrogen production. For example, the European Commission targeting 40 gigawatts of capacity, of electrolyzer capacity by 2030. And that needs to mobilize a multi-billion euro investment. Are investors ready to provide this kind of capital to scale hydrogen? And if I can ask that first to Fabio.
I would say that it's hard to say that investors are ready, because today the investment case, if not because of the heavy subsidies, is not clear. And investors to put money at scale needs to understand the investment case and the risk return profile of what they're putting money in. So PPA agreements where there is a clear and reliable takeoff agreement of a green hydrogen project can be considered obviously by investors, but because someone else is taking out some risk from the investment case. So what kind of risk return are we asking private investors to take during this transition is the real question that we have to answer. And most private investors stepped in the renewables transition because of incentives, because the investment cases in the early days were made extremely attractive. And so money follow money. And if the public environment and the government will be able to promote a very credible and de-risk the investments of private funding being invested into hydrogen, then yes, investor will be able to participate the scaling. I don't see this happening at the scale it should to fulfill of these objectives so far.
Thank you. And Alicia?
I think I have a little bit of a different viewpoint on it based on what we do as a company. So just a little bit of background, we build large scale hydrogen facilities. We start with wind and solar, only in locations that have this perfect diurnal profile of high solar during the day and high wind at night, has an extremely high capacity factor, which means that we can run the downstream equipment at the absolute maximum. They're large projects, they benefit from the economy of scale, they benefit from the location right next to the water, access to water. And so they are able to compete, they are able to get to a price that is low enough to be competitive in different commercial markets. Now, the areas that we look at are more like shipping, co-firing with power, aviation eventually, and industry, heavy industry, and also heavy transport. In all of these areas, we are seeing extremely large offtake demand. People want to buy these products because they need to meet their 2030 goals, they need to meet their 2050 goals. So I very much see that this industry will be built the way that LNG was built. It will be built on back-to-back offtake agreements. It will be financed by ECAs that have even better capital available in green quantities. And then when you get to FID, you get to traditional project finance stages. Everyone wants in these projects. There are so many big sovereign wealth funds, quasi-sovereign wealth funds that are basically pension funds for countries that need to move their money away from fossil fuels and into green industries. And they have too much money to move. They can't invest in a 20 megawatt wind farm. You know, they need to invest in large infrastructure. And this is the first thing that's come along that is actually something that is extremely appealing to them. Now, they only want to invest after everything's been de-risked, and it's a traditional infrastructure project, which is why it all rides on the back of these offtake agreements, and that is exactly how LNG started as well. So it is creating a market, but it's not like we haven't created a market before. And this is something that the off-takers need, that across industries. I'm seeing demand from airlines for syn fuels, which I expected in 2035. But they have to meet deadlines by 2030, and they have nothing they can use. Biofuels, the minute they are available, they either shoot up in price or they're gone. There's not enough. And so this is something that is actually a solution that they can use. And so we very much think that this will be more built on the back of the market transactions than it is, a government investment scheme. What we need from the government is regulation so that the rough fossil fuels are actually including the actual costs of what they produce. Right now, they are not including any of the externalities of what they produce. If they actually paid the real cost for what it is that they're producing, the real cost to us as consumers or as individuals that live near these facilities and have terrible outcomes as a result, if they included those costs, we would be cheaper. Even if they don't include them, we're going to be cheaper once we hit scale. So I think that we attack it by both sides. We stand alone and build the market, and we make it cheaper by having scale. And then we look for some regulatory support so that we can have a more fair playing field.
Super. Alicia, thanks very much for that answer. I think structuring and policy support came up there. I'm going to turn to some of try and synthesize some of the questions that we have coming in as well. One question which I'd like to send to Frank and Paul, their engineering expertise, is that I have a question which is a prominent industry commentator has recently stated that there's no place for blue hydrogen projects that capture 90% or less of CO2 emissions. Do you see any role for fossil fuel-based hydrogen at all? And perhaps I could ask you to answer another question which has come in to explain the difference between blue and green hydrogen as well. Frank, would you like to start?
Yeah, thanks. So basically, green hydrogen is hydrogen made through water electrolysis, and if the power that goes into the process is green, accepted term for typically hydrogen from steam methane reforming of natural gas, whereby you capture the CO2 that's emitted and store it, and there's various storage and storage methodologies, but that's sort of in a nutshell. Now, there's a very simple answer to that question. This week, the Hydrogen Council came out with a new overview over large-scale projects. There's now 359 reported large projects, roughly $1 worth of pipeline. And of that, 1/3 is blue hydrogen. So 1/3 of that volume of projects is blue. And the thing is, the reality is that if we want to start a hydrogen economy at this point in time, we need as much as we can. And there's also benefit, especially in retrofitting existing SMR units with carbon capture installations. Is not a bad thing, but it's also helpful to get us going, to get as much hydrogen, for example, in a pipeline system as we can, and it's going to be challenging to ramp that up at the speed we would need to do that with green. So green and blue will have a place.
Cool.
Okay, so I don't live in Europe, I live in Canada, and in Canada we have a ready market for the export of any high capacity factor, inexpensive green electricity that we might generate. It's the United States, and we already export over high voltage DC lines from projects in Labrador to northern United States, and we've been doing that for decades. So what people are talking about in Canada about hydrogen is all blue hydrogen, really. And the fundamental notion of blue hydrogen as a decarbonization strategy, it depends on what you're using it for. If you're using it to replace black hydrogen, which is how 98.7% of the stuff that we use in the world is made, then it's better than black hydrogen for sure. You know, reforming methane, you have methane leakage associated with the production and the transportation of the methane, and then you have post-combustion capture and in-process capture of CO2 that's produced from the hydrogen process. And in Canada, we know how to do that. We're doing it right now. We've been doing it for 4 years at scale. We know what it costs. It's extremely expensive. It costs at least $150 a ton, 150 Canadian dollars a ton to capture the CO2 that's emitted by hydrogen production at one upgrader in northern Alberta. It's the Scotford upgrader. It's a project that's called Quest. It was originally done by Shell. It cost $1.3 billion of taxpayer money, all of it taxpayer money. And it costs $50 million a year to bury 1 million tons of CO2 per year. And to do the math on that, that's about 100,000 tons of hydrogen. And by the way, that's only 30% of the CO2 emissions from one upgrader in just Alberta. So the scale at which you'd have to do it is really troublesome. The cost of it is really troublesome. But what's amazing is, whereas in the Gulf Coast of the United States, you can get hydrogen, wholesale cost of around between $1 and $1.50 a kilogram, adding $150 a ton of CO2 capture to it only increases the price to $3, to $3 per kilogram. So it's absolutely going to be a competitor, and it's existentially important to the people in the fossil fuel industry and the fossil fuel distribution industry who see it as their golden ticket out of basically having to find something else to do post decarbonization. They see it as the way that they can convince people that their assets in the ground are worth money in the future, and they're pushing it hard. And so that's actually part of my problem with the whole hydrogen economy thing.
Perfect. Okay, well, on the sort of heat map, we've got questions coming in at the moment. A lot of questions about the kind of relationship between solar and electrolyzers, particularly around learning rates. So can we look at the learning rates that we've achieved in solar as a modular technology and apply that to electrolyzers? Can we expect them to come down from the costs we're seeing now, when we have modeled them to be about €4 per kilo in Europe now? What do you see learning rates taking those down to being affordable and meeting the kind of EU goal of about €2 per kilo by 2030, or is that not applicable? And I'm happy to open the floor to that one.
I don't mind starting. I mean, there is some initial evidence, albeit from a very small statistical basis, but there seems to be a learning rate of 18.5%. I mean, it's slightly less than solar, which is a little bit over 20. By the way, learning rate means that if you double output, you would reduce the unit cost by that margin. So the more you do it, the cheaper it gets, and that has to do with increasing efficiencies and increasing scale and supply chain management and all the things. But 18.5% is what the literature tells us now. There's not something in most electrolyzers that is difficult. It's it's steel, it's zinc, it's readily available material. So we know that the more we do it, the cheaper it'll get.
I think everything has a learning rate to some degree. The question really is, it has to be taken apart into a couple parts. And one part of it is the cost of the electrolyzers. Electrolyzers are definitely a developing, but also an established technology. So it's not like we're inventing electrolyzers for the first time. PEM was the last big proton exchange membrane electrolyzers was the last big thing, and that's a 1960s invention. So the challenge here is whether or not the learning rate is sufficient in order to drop the cost of capital. And the capital has to be carefully considered as well. The electrolyzer is an important part of a hydrogen production system, but it's only a part of it. And I think Alicia's organization has the right mindset in relation to the rest of it. There's the equipment, okay, and then there's the balance of plant, the outside battery limits, or even the inside battery limits, stuff like compressors and storage and pipes and instrumentation, controls, and all that other stuff. And the only way that you get that portion down in cost per kilogram of hydrogen produced is to do it at giant scale. The trouble with that, of course, is that leaves the giant problem of distribution. And right now, we make all hydrogen in the world to within, say, 10%, where we use it. We don't actually distribute much of it at all. So let's look at pipelines as an example. In the United States, there's about 1,600 miles of hydrogen pipeline, and there's 2 million miles of natural gas pipeline, almost all of which you can't use for pure hydrogen. So you have to rip it out and replace it. So it's not looking good from my perspective, because in order to achieve those low marginal costs per kilogram of hydrogen, you need to do it at giant scale, and then it leaves the distribution problem. So that's a challenge.
If I may quickly respond to that, because I mean, there's been extensive studies done into converting natural gas pipelines. France has done it, GRTgaz has done it for France. Several European transmission system operators have done it. There's even an alliance formed to do that. And, you know, about 70% can be done without major upgrades. You have to change the compressors, you have to change the flow meters, but the pipeline material itself, the gaskets, the valves, etc., they're all very easily retrofittable to accommodate hydrogen. So and I've seen similar studies for Australia. I've seen them from Canada, so I'm not sure where the knowledge for the US comes from. But the 200,000 kilometers high pressure gas pipeline system in Europe, 70–80% can be converted to accommodate hydrogen. So you have that infrastructure, a major asset in this whole equation.
Let me move on to what I think is an excellent question, which brings up the subject of demand for hydrogen. And that comes in from Colin Heron. With all this capacity, can I ask where the customers are for all of this green hydrogen? And he postulates the EU car industry is not going to use it. Does anybody have any thoughts about the sectors that we can really see hydrogen in, and views on transport? Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think, and if you want to start with transport, I think heavy transport, forklifts, buses, you know, I think Frank probably has 4,000 huge heavy trucks that can use it right now. There is a need for, beyond the personal car, beyond the Lotus-shaped, you know, Tesla, there is a need for these very, very heavy transport, and that need to be refueled and need to go long distances. So that's just one tiny sector. For us, because we ship, we export, we want to do it by ammonia. We think that's the easiest, cleanest way to get it from one place to another. And there are many sectors that can use ammonia as ammonia without having to crack it back to hydrogen. So, you know, shipping can use it instead of bunker fuel. Bunker fuel is awful. So replacing bunker fuel is fantastic. You can use it in co-firing. So North Asia has put out their hydrogen roadmaps. They want to replace all of their coal and gas turbines with ammonia, starting with a 20% mix, which they've already tested, and that actually works. And I think aviation eventually is going to have to use some kind of syn fuel that uses hydrogen as a base, but you have to add a carbon and get something kind of kerosene-like a jet fuel. So there are a number of sectors that can use hydrogen or can use ammonia as ammonia, or possibly green methanol or syn fuels, but all of them using hydrogen as the basis. And many of them have made commitments and have to using hydrogen, and large enough amounts that exceed anything that has been mentioned today. Any project, all of our projects, mentioned or not, all of the smaller projects, there is really not enough being produced to meet the demand that has been stated. So I don't see that as an issue. What I see is making sure that we can create the product in a efficient manner, which means either you produce at the cheapest cost possible because you have the best sites in the world and you can export, or you're producing locally and using locally because the cost of transport is quite difficult. If you could have a pipeline right there, it's great. If you have a use right there, it's great. But, you know, it's hard to move hydrogen from one part of the world to the other. So, you know, the ammonia is a necessary way to move it. And then if you can move it, then using it as ammonia first, that's the low-hanging fruit, because obviously you don't want to go through the extra change back to hydrogen. So this is the most efficient use that we've seen.
Does anybody have sorry, Alicia. I just wanted to ask the panel if there was bringing a question on transport and maybe close off that transport debate.
Oh, yeah, I'm just itching. Sorry. Oh, yeah, this is another. Perhaps
I can throw this in for you, Paul.
Yeah, go for it.
Why is no one discussing the well-to-wheel efficiency problem? Asked John.
Yeah. So, you see, I'd love to hear people making green ammonia. I think it's fantastic. You know, we make 40 We use 40 million tons of hydrogen a year, all of it black, all of it made without carbon capture to make ammonia. About half the nitrogen and the protein in our own bodies came from Haber-Bosch ammonia originally. It's extremely important that we address ammonia production. And until we've done that, and we haven't done it at all, using ammonia as a fuel is basically energetic vandalism. It doesn't do anything for decarbonization meaningfully relative to doing something else that might actually make more logistical sense. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. The applications that can be electrified, and there are heavy transport applications that can be directly electrified. They're not jet aircraft and transoceanic ships for sure, but there are lots of applications that can be electrified, and they should be and will be electrified because it'll be the cheapest way to go about doing it. The ones that people are talking about, the long distance heavy transport, like for instance, running trucks on ice roads up into northern Canada in order to resupply First Nations communities there, hydrogen's not a feasible alternative. You need a liquid fuel to do those applications. And so there are two options for decarbonized liquid fuels. There are biofuels, and then there are fuels that are made by trying to run thermodynamics backwards, by taking CO2 and hydrogen, reacting them with one another, and making the hydrogen from water using electricity. So ultimately taking electricity and the products of combustion and running thermodynamics backwards to make fuel molecules that you can use. And those processes are extremely inefficient. By extremely inefficient, I mean they struggle to achieve double-digit efficiencies from energy source back to mechanical energy again out of the engine shaft. And when something wastes 90% of the energy that it's fed, that ends up having a high cost. It's rather difficult for it to be otherwise. Even if the input energy is cheap, wasting tenfold makes it that much harder to make it cheap enough to be able to afford. And the problem I have with all of this is that biofuels, the reason biofuels aren't in the market, the reason that cellulosic biofuels aren't in the market is that the policy drivers to push them into the market and to push the fossil alternatives out of the market aren't in place. So saying that there's no biofuels capacity and hydrogen is the solution to that, or ammonia is the solution to that, it's a really questionable statement in my view. I think we need the policy supports first, and then, so, you know, high carbon tax as an example, or emission bans in major cities. And then let's see what the transport industry can produce. And I totally agree with Colin, cars and light trucks, forget it. Hydrogen's a dead duck.
Let me ask another question, perhaps another fundamental question, and I might ask this to Fabio from the investor perspective. Roll a couple together here. So Kieran asks, if not hydrogen, then what is the alternative to decarbonize? And there's also a second question I can throw in with that, which is about capital efficiency. What's the most efficient use of capital to decarbonize? If not hydrogen, then what?
Yeah, today the most efficient use of capital to decarbonize changes from application to application. We have to always consider what do we need the energy for. In transport, we need it to move things. In buildings, to heat. So the ultimate driver should be the final consumption, the demand. And so the best capital allocation is the one that creates that calories and that power to the wheel, and that uses the least capital. Today, in transport, in major transport application, electric vehicles plus renewables represent the easiest way and the most capital efficient way to decarbonize, especially for the long term. And so that should be the way and the alternative in passengers cars. And I think that is more or less clear to most people today. And in buildings where we rely on fuels, obviously the investment case is much tougher because heat pumps for a building cost a lot in many areas with respect to a cheap natural gas sources to shift. But through bans, through carbon taxes, this is increasingly changing. And then in terms of capital allocation, I think that as Alicia said, market participants will decide and will promote if they're willing to pay for hydrogens coming and being shipped in. Fine, perfect. That will help everybody and us all to decarbonize. But when public money are involved, I think there is a duty to make sure that if the goal is the decarbonization, and we are talking about this not because hydrogen technology has changed significantly since the last cycle that you mentioned at the beginning, but we are talking of this today because decarbonization has become a priority. And so when you allocate public funding, you need to consider that that's your priority. And so capital efficiency should be a priority also for hydrogen-related application. And in this regard, what is important is that they make feasible things that are not feasible for private capital. So hard to abate projects where hydrogen is probably or most likely to, from what we know today, the only solution to decarbonize steel and production. The public fund, the public money have to step in and make it feasible and get the kickstart.
Let me ask, I've got another, I think, what is a fundamental question here, which is, what is the ultimate driver for today's significant and renewed interest in hydrogen? Is it technical or political? And what is the role of the fossil fuel industry in this push? And that's from Corey. I'm going to ask that to Frank. Do you think, I'm guessing you think the answer to that is a technical rather than political?
No, it's both. I don't think it's either or. You know, and again, it depends a little bit on where you are. If you're Japan, you're burning an awful lot of coal right now in your electricity sector because of the nuclear disaster, and that's not a good thing. So you're looking at decarbonization options, and one of the avenues they're looking at is burning ammonia instead of biofuels, which has some issues that they don't like. But if you're Europe, you have an energy system that's largely based on natural gas that you buy from people that that are not your friends per se, and hydrogen provides an option to solve that problem. First of all, you can decarbonize your gas sector using infrastructure that you already have, and you have a lot more options to buy the hydrogen. You can make it yourself, but you buy it from people that you choose. So it's a bit of both. I mean, technically, it's not as challenging as some people think. And mind you, we did have hydrogen in European cities, but also in the United States and Hawaii, which was called town gas. In Portugal, even until the 80s. So converting that to natural gas was something that was done not long ago, and converting back is also not rocket science. It's something that we've done and that we can do again.
Perfect. And I think, Alicia, I believe I'm correct in thinking you have projects in Australia.
Yes.
Perhaps you're the person to answer this question then, which is, I'm getting a lot of questions about water use and electrolysis. Is water use, is it a significant user of water?
So in order to get the great profile that we like, ideally you have a desert on the water and it's seawater. So we use seawater, we desalinate it. The desalination, the major cost in desalination is the electrons. So it's extremely inexpensive. It's about 1% of our cost to desalinate. We don't use fresh water, but as a byproduct of the ammonia process, we get fresh water. So for all of our communities, we give them potable water. We try to less desertify. There's definitely a better word for that. We're trying to take the desert back and have some kind of food security and use that water for good purposes, and sometimes even a lake, with fish. So no, we specifically, and I think not all projects are like this, but we specifically use seawater and not potable water that people need.
Here I've got to jump in and violently agree with Alicia, because the problem with hydrogen is not water, it's energy. So to give you an idea, it takes about 0.035 kilowatt hours to desalinate enough seawater to make enough fresh water to make a kilogram of hydrogen. It's a tiny bit above the thermodynamic minimum to do it, but it takes over 50 kilowatt hours per kilogram of hydrogen to electrolyze water to make a kilogram of hydrogen. And the thermodynamic limit there is 39 kilowatt hours per kilogram. So we're already bumping up against that limit. And if you use grid electricity rather than the wind and solar that is correctly being pitched for this, the amount of water used to make that 50 kilowatt hours is vastly greater, vastly orders of magnitude greater than the amount of water that's needed to make. So this to make that kilogram of hydrogen. So the water use thing, it's really just a misunderstanding of the basic chemistry and physics.
Yeah, so for our projects, it's not an issue, but it is an issue in some projects, and definitely one, you know, we have to be careful of because people need water.
Let me ask another really quite fundamental question that's come in from Guy Panard, who asks, what is the position of the panel about the need to quickly increase the CO2 emissions taxes for driving the change that needs to be made towards hydrogen and other solutions? And I'll just add some context from our own modeling. We do see that blue hydrogen is, if facing a carbon price of 90 euros per ton or more, blue hydrogen with carbon capture suddenly becomes competitive with grey hydrogen. But what does the panel think? Is carbon taxation the way to drive uptake of blue and green hydrogen projects?
Okay, can I
please
just talk? Yes, I mean, I definitely think that we should have carbon taxation, but the difference between blue and green is vast. So you're going to have to do an audit on what happened with that green. And I mean, with the blue, the green's very easy. The green is nice. So you know what you got, you know what went into it. But all the blues are different, even if they're using carbon capture. How well are they doing it? How well is it going to be sequestered? How much loss was there? Are they flaring? I mean, there's just so many things that need to be included in that, that it's going to be very complicated. Now, it is an improvement over gray. I agree. So if they can get those numbers down, then they will be competitive by investing all of that other capital into removing the carbon. But I think it needs to be two different types of taxation for blue, and blue isn't even a thing. The whole range of non-green, I would say.
Another way to put it is that we're likely to get, if you do gradual creeping carbon taxes, you're likely to get really, you know, the black hydrogen that people call gray, which is really 30% blacker per joule than the fossil fuel it's made from. If you put creeping carbon taxes in place, what'll happen is they'll make that black hydrogen kind of a muddy black blue bruise colored hydrogen because that's easy, right? So if you look at a steam methane reformer, a good chunk of the CO2 comes out of the gas purification train as CO2, and that's easy to capture. That takes very little effort to capture. It's being captured already because you need to remove it from the product before you sell it. It's the post-combustion capture that's the hard part, the expensive part, and that's where a lot of the CO2 ends up. It ends up in the tube furnace flue, and recovering that is really no easier than recovering the CO2 from a gas turbine. So, you know, my concern with blue hydrogen is that if you're in the fossil fuel industry, it's your savior, it's your salvation, and you would really love government to pay for all of the capital improvements that are required in order to get that product to market that will allow you to keep in the energy business in the future. And honestly, I don't think that's a desirable outcome for the world or for decarbonization.
Okay, and thanks, Paul. That's again a great perspective on colours there as well. Very useful to talk about the colours debate. Another fundamental question, I think, from David Thomason. What is the most important form of subsidy or policy support to facilitate investment in green hydrogen? So maybe I'll send that one to you, Fabio, because you talked about maybe the structures financially not being ready, the market not being quite ready yet. Is there a policy support mechanism that gets it over the line?
To my knowledge, it's hard to mention someone specifically geared towards green hydrogen that really improves the case. And maybe across the world there are policies that I'm not aware, knowing and being focused on Europe rather than anything else. But the carbon tax that was mentioned before is overall the best way and the most effective way. And then there are some differences from a pure carbon tax that is not applied anywhere in the world with the cap and trade model for as the ETS scheme, or the Chinese ETS scheme that is being put in place that can drive and improve investment cases for alternative technologies, because that ultimately is what you want, provide a more attractive investment case for green hydrogen development. So I don't think there is a single government policies I can point at this stage.
Yeah, thanks, Fabio. Maybe just to add to that, I mean, last week we've seen the Fit for 55 package announced by the European Commission, and that had two major elements towards the hydrogen strategy, and they're both obligations. So they don't cost, the Commission or the government directly money. It's not a subsidy per se, but it's an obligation on an industry. One is the people that at the moment use hydrogen, they're obliged to have 50% green hydrogen by 2030. And the other one is that there is a sector target within the Renewable Energy Directive, the recast thereof. I think it's 2.6% out of 13. So anybody that sells fuels into the European Union, they will have to have 13% renewable fuels, and 2.6% of that must be what they call renewable fuels of non-biological origin, which is a difficult set of words for hydrogen. And that actually applies to refineries. So refineries operate, they're always short in hydrogen. The option would be to add an electrolyzer to that and reduce the output of the SMR units that they have.
Perfect. And I might just follow up on that answer, Frank, if I may. Question from Joshua: is the EU aim of 6 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity by 2024 at all likely, given we're in the low hundreds of megawatts currently? I know that you've obviously, for your career, done a lot of work on scaling up energy technologies. What's your view?
I'm sorry, was that directed to me?
Yeah, who?
Yes, sorry, I think we've lost Frank for a moment. Paul, could you step in on that one, and then I'll pass that back.
I think I'm here.
Oh, Frank,
yeah. I mean,
well, go ahead, Frank.
Did you get the question?
The Fit for 55. The Fit for 55 question. The Fit for 55 package is 2030, but there's a sub target for 6 gigawatt, and that so the two targets that I just mentioned, they relate to roughly 40 gigawatts of installed electrolyzer capacity within the European Union. But the 6 gigawatt 2024 target is immediate. I mean, you need to have massive pipeline right now. And yes, there is, a lot of work being done towards that. So it's not impossible, but it's going to be challenging.
I would just like to jump in and say that decarbonizing hydrogen itself, if you had renewable electricity at 100% capacity factor, it would take over 500 gigawatts of electrolyzer capacity just to decarbonize the 90 million tons of hydrogen a year that will need post-decarbonization. So at a 50% capacity factor, that's 1,000 gigawatts. So a target of 6 by 2030, that's just indicating that we're not actually going to get anywhere in terms of decarbonization using this modality.
It's 6 by 2024.
Well, sounds great.
6 by 2024.
Sounds great. And as mentioned, we don't have a gigawatt now, like not one.
Let me, because I don't think we've touched a lot on the decarbonisation of industry enough. There's a question that's coming from Rick, which I'll add one on myself to, which is that without decarbonising steel first, what's the carbon footprint of building all the new electrolyzers? Can we talk a little bit about steel, and if not hydrogen to decarbonize steel, then what? Or do you think that hydrogen is the way through direct reduction of iron to decarbonize the steel sector?
It's already 10% of hydrogen use in the world. It's just used as syngas, not pure hydrogen. So yeah, it's a major way to decarbonize steel, major. And it's a high merit order use for any green hydrogen or even blue hydrogen that you might happen to make. I mean, that's what a true hard to decarbonize sector is. It's not transport, it's not heating, home heating. The hydrogen there is used as a reducing agent. It's a chemical feedstock, and that's what we need hydrogen for. We don't That's a true high merit order, hard to decarbonize sector, and it's actually a major user of hydrogen in the world right now.
I completely agree with that. I just think there are other sectors that can also use hydrogen and ammonia and different hydrogen products. But yes, for steel is the most efficient use of energy for that process because of the chemical reaction. So I don't know why we wouldn't. The main issue with the hydrogen right now is it's captive, right? So we can't get in there and make it green. Whoever's making it now needs to do that. And we need to, they need to be incentivized to do that. And the way that you incentivize them is not by giving them subsidies and not by making it an easy way for them to change, but by charging them the actual costs of what they've been doing. This is my viewpoint on it. You need to
amen to that.
You actually need to include what are the real costs, because these externalities have never been included. And so we make ridiculous economic decisions because it seems like gas is so cheap. Well, it's not cheap. It's actually super expensive, and it's hurting a lot of the world, not just for a greenhouse effect. So I think that's the main, from a regulatory perspective, that's what needs to happen. And then people will make the decision to move into these different greener industries because it's actually economically makes more sense as well.
I will jump in and say that there are some two birds with one stone opportunities. This so-called turquoise hydrogen, there are companies out there that are making carbon products with low or no CO2 emission hydrogen as a byproduct. That has limited potential because you would just make giant quantities of carbon that would end up absolutely becoming a waste if you tried to scale that beyond a small portion of the market. But where you're displacing carbon product production that's currently made from heavy oil, it's a grand idea. And where it's done properly, it can make money even without carbon taxes. And that's extremely rare. So, a small thing, don't overextend it. Don't think that it's going to scale to be 50% of hydrogen production or even maybe 10% of hydrogen production. But where it's possible, it's desirable. But the product is carbon. Hydrogen's a byproduct.
That's a good one.
so I think, if I'm not wrong, that there is some agreement on the panel regarding, hydrogen as decarbonizing hydrogen as a chemical feedstock. Maybe the disagreement is around the energetic use of hydrogen. Let me move on to another question we've got through the chat, which is a question around where do you see hydrogen in cooling and heating? Is there an application for is there an application of hydrogen for heating, residentially or commercially, or in industrial heat?
I think this is, I just jump in very, very quickly. This is probably one of the most controversial one. As Frank said, he claims that you can use existing gas infrastructure in Europe, and I don't think everybody would agree around that. Obviously, gas players and incumbent players tends to promote that. But from a purely energetic point of view, and the cycle of energy starting from renewables, assuming that we want to go green hydrogen, and that's the best solution, and that we all agree on that, heat pumps represent the best solution if you have enough electricity. That might not be the case for Japan, that might not be the case for certain areas where we will still need gas, but from an energy cycle point of view, heat pumps should be the way.
And the reason, let's be clear, the reason that we use fuels to make heat right now is because it's cheap. And part of the reason that it's cheap is we're dumping, the effluent to the atmosphere free of charge or very cheap, right?
That's it.
Using the atmosphere as a free public sewer, then burning stuff to make heat makes absolute sense. And when you start with electricity, which is thermodynamic work, not heat, the logical thing to do with it is to use it as work, not as heat. Now, there are a few applications. Now, they're few. They're narrow. There are a few applications where you absolutely need to burn something. It's needed for process reasons. Temperatures are too high, and the energy has to be dissipated inside something that's already lined with refractory, et cetera. And in those applications, there are other fuel options, and hydrogen is one of them. And the question is, what's the highest merit order use for those materials? And again, I certainly comfort heating, it ain't it. Like, it's just not sensible use for hydrogen at all.
I have a slightly more nuanced view on that. I mean, there are several projects, and again, I get back to Europe because there's a lot of activity in Europe. Of all the major projects, half of them are in Europe. And Europe is a gas continent. As I said before, we have 200,000 kilometers of high pressure gas pipes and a multitude of that in the distribution system. And people are working on hydrogen backbones, like in the Netherlands, in Germany, in France, in Spain. They're working on hydrogen backbones, and those are massive pipes, and they are going to be filled. So you will have hydrogen, and then if you have hydrogen and the price is right, conversion efficiency left, right, and center, you're going to look at, can I use it? And then if you're drying potatoes in the north of the Netherlands and you've been burning natural gas forever, and then the only thing you need to do is change a burner, and you have hydrogen at your doorstep, you're going to use that. So I think there will be applications where that will come into play in the near future.
I would just add one little thing too. I mean, I think we overlook the damage that gas does in our homes. So, they're saying half of the asthma, that children get is from the gas in their homes. So the gas burning for your cooking, using gas in your homes, it's not just about the global warming. It's not just about climate change. It's not just about, it's also health. It's actually a terrible use in your home. So if you have the legacy infrastructure and it's possible to use something that is not going to harm your health, then that might be another reason to switch to that.
Sorry, but when you burn hydrogen in air, you make NOx. And the problem with burning stuff in your home is primarily NOx. Natural gas burns pretty cleanly from a particulates perspective. The stuff that's bothersome is the NOx, and you get NOx when you burn it. You don't get NOx when you feed hydrogen to a fuel cell. But for cooking, we shouldn't be using fire. It's just the reality.
No, I'm actually also, I think we should be using electric. My husband's a cook, so he really doesn't agree with me. There's a fight on the cooking.
Sorry, Lucy, I'm going to just ask the final question here because we're nearly out of time, and I'll try and, I'm afraid we've had over 100 questions. I'm trying to aggregate them. I won't be able to answer all of these. I'm sure the panelists will be able to contact them separately. I want to ask about, does the panel see very briefly either a global seaborne trade in hydrogen, either as liquefied hydrogen or ammonia in 10, 20 years time? Or alternatively, do they see those being used as a fuel for shipping internationally?
I think it'll be a shipping fuel, definitely. But also it can, not hydrogen, sorry, ammonia, I think will be a shipping fuel. And then it can move ammonia around as well. And there are a lot of efficiencies with that.
I would love to see Australia and Chile, for instance, corner the market in the production of green ammonia that the world pays a premium for because it's green. I would love to see that. My concern is just using it as a fuel. I don't have a good solution for shipping. Maybe shipping will have to go to something like ammonia. I see no market for shipping either compressed gaseous or liquefied hydrogen at all. I think that's technologically fundamentally fraught. Ammonia makes a lot more sense, but I don't see it as a feasible means of shipping energy around. I see it as a product that we desperately need in the world that needs to be decarbonized.
Frank, Fabio, any thoughts on the global ammonia hydrogen trade?
I think it's a credible solution for fuel of ships, as Alicia said, at least from what we know to today. And as Paul was saying, I don't think it's an efficient way of capital to build a global infrastructure for having shipping hydrogen shipped all around the world. But we need hydrogen as a product, as a chemical feedstock.
Perfect. All right. Well, I'll summarize very, very briefly. I think we do have there a lot of disagreement, as we've seen, on the exact uses of hydrogen, blue versus green. But I do think there is some consensus that we've seen on the use of hydrogen decarbonisation as a chemical feedstock, as I say. Well, I thank you all for it. I'd like to thank all the participants and hand back to Luke to close out the session.
Yeah, I'd like to second that, and of course, thank you, Simon, for leading that discussion and getting through all those questions. Obviously, a lot to keep your eyes on. Yeah, thank you all to our audience for tuning in and getting involved. I thought that was a lot of fun. I learned an awful lot, and I hope you guys did too. A lot of disagreement, but also a lot of agreement on both sides of the coin. Do stay tuned for our work in Reuters, our Reuters work in hydrogen and other fields too. And I do wish you a pleasant rest of your day or morning or evening, wherever we are in the world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.